Atlas's N-scale line for the longest time had been very infamous for converting to DCC with a few exceptions. While the company made strides here, there was really not much in terms of the way of progress, shall we say, since the 1980s. Which was like totally whacked, man. sorry. Where was I? Oh, yes. One of the most infamous models in this regard is the Alco RS3 model that Atlas introduced way back in the early 80s as an Atlas Kato model back when it was still partnered with Kato Model Trains of Japan. While these locomotives for the time had extremely refined drivetrains and ran very smoothly, not to mention reliably, they were not what we call easy to convert to DCC despite some early ads from Atlas. While Train Control Systems, or TCS as they're better known as, had developed the CN-type decoder to slip into this and similar type frames, and slight variations of it for other frames, this type decoder set up while designed to be technically a drop-in, still violates the NMRA's definition of DCC ready, as it requires one to isolate the motor from the frame. While this is supposed to be easy, there are mixed results with this particular decoder setup, with it being a bit of a challenge to get it to work correctly without blowing a decoder, or at least that's been my experience, which was one total bummer, dudes. Sorry, where was I? Situation was so bad that it led several hobbyists such as myself in the N-scale model railroad hobby looking to convert their Alco RS3s from Atlas to DCC, taking the extreme measure of remounting the shell from the RS3 onto a Kato RS2 chassis. All that said, up until more recent times, this tactic was the most reliable way, in my opinion, to convert one of these locomotives over to DCC, even if it was an extreme measure. As in addition to the DCC readiness and a good selection of DCC decoders, one also gained the reliability of the Kato drivetrain, but most notably the parts availability for it, with the one minor exception being the fact that the Kato chassis is just a little bit too short for the Atlas RS3 body. All that said, the Atlas RS3 N-scale chassis essentially remained stagnant, while all the rest of Atlas's models got an update to a chassis that was at least more DCC ready. Okay, fine, the frame had to be split, but hey, you didn't have to isolate the motor, and if you were careful enough, you could essentially drop the decoder in place. And yes, Kapton tape was required if you used one of the cheaper decoders, or at least that's what the instructions stated. It should also be noted that many factory DCC locomotives from Atlas from this era in N-scale did not have their frames isolated from the factory with Kapton tape. But still, despite all of these annoying quirks, the rest of the Atlas line definitely benefited from this upgrade, while the Atlas RS3 and a few other of Atlas's models remained stuck in a time warp, firmly stuck in its 1980s heritage. Like, gag me with a spoon, Atlas. Now the dudes of Atlas have decided to make a totally awesome new version of this locomotive that's sound ready from the factory and actually DCC ready. Question you dudes and dudettes probably have is this locomotive totally awesome or totally lame? Well, let's take a look and see what's up here. So sorry, I don't know why I keep slipping into that stupid voice. First off, things look a little bit too familiar here. In fact, way too familiar. The horns are in the exact same location as before, and feature the annoying bulky traits in which Kato built into them to make them stronger with their wider bases. And again, if this looks very familiar, well it should. Essentially this is exactly how they were on the previous models dating all the way back to the 1980s. Totally lame, dudes. So I guess I'll just save your time and mine by ending this review right here. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and as always, keep the metal side down. Okay. There's a little bit more to this model than I've just let on. But seriously, folks, Atlas had a chance to really make something of this locomotive and really drop the ball on not changing any details whatsoever, as the Alco RS3 has to be one of the most, if not the most, customized locomotive in the history of early North American diesel locomotives. With an unlimited number of horns being utilized in these engines, as well as headlights, as well as steam generators, as well as more mundane things such as the smokestacks, etc. And the best Atlas could do essentially was offer this locomotive in a few different paint jobs, / paint schemes that were simply not available previously, or in some cases with different numbers. And yes, before you ask, there are absolutely no road-specific details added to any of these locomotives, even when the paint scheme differs, just to make it very clear. They're all the exact same prototype locomotive as they were produced back in the 80s, with the exceptions of those updates this model received during the early 90s refresh. With very few exceptions, such as the fact that the coupler is now body-mounted instead of truck-mounted. And that's essentially it. Luckily for Atlas and many Alco fans like myself, there is still much more to this locomotive. There's an old saying, and I'm sure most of you watching this channel are familiar with, if not all of you, that beauty is only skin deep. And in fact, the exact opposite is true of this particular model. To see what I'm talking about, we need only remove the shell of the locomotive, which admittedly is a little bit tricky, although not nearly as difficult as it was on the earlier models. And as we can see, this is where everything turns around 180 degrees. We have a brand new coreless motor, I believe this is, with dual flywheels, both of which are larger than they were originally, that is to say the motor and the flywheels. And in addition, and most notably, a speaker, and of course the before-mentioned DCC readiness provided by an ESU E24 socket. This in itself is controversial, as the E24 socket is something that ESU has actually produced themselves in terms of a standard which hasn't been quite ratified yet, from what I understand, although Digitrax appears to be making decoders to these specifications. Another interesting note is the continued trend to move away from contact pickups and going directly to wires. While the previous variations of the Alco RS3 from Atlas utilized contact pickup systems, as did most Atlas N-scale models, this particular model is utilizing wires to connect the trucks with the actual frame and the decoder itself. Apparently this is to improve conductivity, and while the contacts did make maintaining these locomotives very simple, requiring only a screwdriver to change a truck out, they apparently lack the consistency to keep a steady flow of power going to something as demanding as a DCC and sound decoder, despite the fact that modern DCC and sound decoders take less power. It's important to note that this locomotive does not actually have a keep alive capacitor installed. That said, there appears to be a socket here for one to be installed later on. Hopefully someone will come up with one that plugs right into this slot. The pluses continue in the drivetrain department for this locomotive. The main word I have here is refinement. This locomotive runs extremely smooth. You can't even hear it running. Finally, something comparable to Atlas's HO scale line. While Atlas's previous N-scale models with these contact pickup systems and older school motors, etc., were known to be pretty smooth runners for what they were, they still made noticeable gear grinding noises when they ran around the tracks, even when they ran correctly. That, again, is not the case with this new model. You can barely hear it run, and it finally feels like it's more on par with Atlas's smooth-running HO scale classic models. Speaking of hearing these particular locomotives, the sound on them is quite good, and it should be, as it is in fact provided by ESU Loc Sound. It should be noted that because the sound effects file comes right from ESU's library, it means that the Atlas N-scale Alco RS3 is going to sound like any other Alco RS3 with an ESU sound decoder in it for the most part. But really, is that such a bad thing? It's kind of like saying my cheap economy car happens to look like a Ferrari. Are you really going to complain about something like that? And just listen to that 244 as this RS3 negotiates that twisty, turny, interurban track on my 2024-2025 Christmas layout. In sharp contrast to the Alco FA model released by Atlas last year, which was so inaudible you could just barely hear it when idling at a station and when all the other trains were stopped. Once you put the locomotive into motion, largely all you heard was motor noise, which I might add was also excessive, in sharp contrast to this model. Like the rest of my 2024-2025 Christmas layout, it's composed entirely of Kato Unitracks. And yes, those turns are as low as 150 millimeters, although most of these curves are 183 millimeters. While the locomotive itself has no trouble negotiating sharp curves, getting cars around these curves is another issue, although I find that's a common problem across the board. After much exhaustive testing, which I have done on this layout and most other layouts which have had this problem, I again came to the conclusion that the problem has to do with the fact that the coupler is in fact body-mounted on the locomotive, but truck-mounted on the car in question, or cars in question, in this case, that attempt to make these curves, essentially pushing those cars off the track when the tight turns come up. As again, the body-mounted coupler does not have the travel that a truck-mounted coupler has, and because those couplers are again truck-mounted, they tend to push the whole truck off the track when negotiating a twisty section. The way I got around, again, getting cars around these tight turns on my Christmas layout, if you haven't seen the videos I've made on it yet, which should eventually be up if they aren't already by the time this video finally gets released, I accomplish this by simply using a long shank coupler, in this case running an old Rapido coupler connected to one of my Kato RS2s. The tracking ability of this locomotive seems to be pretty good, although I have noticed some weird quirks. I have noticed that this locomotive model has a tendency to derail in very strange and random locations, and for no apparent reason or provocation, if you will, nor for that matter any consistency. This does not appear to have anything to do with the gauging of the wheels, as it appears to take place in all of the examples I've picked up from this most recent revision of the Alco RS3. I have noticed, as I've been producing this video and testing this locomotive, that there is a little excessive flashing on some of the trucks from some of these examples. Although this doesn't completely solve the problem, it has improved the tracking ability. And again, I must emphasize that this does not occur frequently, it is highly infrequent, but just a weird quirk of this locomotive. The ESU Loc Sound edition of Atlas's Alco RS3 features the standard sound effects one would expect, such as the flange squeal, the horn, the bell, and some other niceties added in on the higher numbers. I'm unable to test them because this particular DCC system only supports functions 1 through 10. Incidentally, like the rest of the Atlas N-scale line that bears the Sound Ready Monarch, upgrading one of these chassis to sound isn't actually difficult at all, as the speaker is already mounted in place, all set to go, and even wired into the standard E24 socket. All one needs is a Loc Sound E24 decoder, which will snap right into the standard E24 socket. You'll also need a programmer or a hobby shop that's willing to program it with the sound on board for you, and you're all set to go, essentially. This, however, can get pretty expensive, with this decoder sometimes costing in excess of $100 by itself, essentially doubling the price. So in my opinion, and my advice considering the pricing on this locomotive, which we'll get into a little bit, it's a good idea to buy the locomotive with sound if you can find it, with a few exceptions, and that is if the price is beyond astronomical. Pricing for these locomotives is a little bit all over the place. Full retail for the Sound Ready variant of the Alco RS3 is $139.95. As for the Loc Sound Equipped Gold version, in full retail will be $249.95. Now these prices may seem kind of steep, but unfortunately that's pretty typical with inflation these days. However, if you were to look, say, at a retail, you'll get a better price. From some of the outfits selling on eBay, for example, you can frequently find the DCC and Sound Ready variant for $109. As for the Loc Sound variant of this particular locomotive, you can get it anywhere from $179 all the way up to $190, and in some cases, if you're looking for a rare paint scheme, as much as $350, but again, that's for a very much more in-demand paint scheme, such as the Delaware and Hudson. Overall, while I'm very pleased with this new revision of the Alco RS3, I can't help but be disappointed, as Atlas made no attempt to upgrade the aging body from what it was from the early 90s. They could have at least done something with the horns, smokestacks, steam generators, etc. to give some road-specific details, but unfortunately they decided to stick with it. The one advantage, I guess, is that one who happens to own an older locomotive that's not DCC ready from the factory, or would like to install sound in it, can simply buy one of these and swap the chassis. All that said, I can definitely call this locomotive a buy, if you can find one, as the stock of these locomotives is plummeting, and therefore prices are going through the roof. So my advice, move quick, or get ready to pay insanely high prices. And that's going to do it for this video, dudes and dudettes. Hope you all enjoyed it and thought it was totally rad. If you did, give it a like. If not, thumbs down it. Don't forget to subscribe for more totally awesome content, and keep the metal side down. Now, if you'll pardon me, I gotta get my DeLorean warmed up and get myself some Pepsi Free. Pepsi Free? What do you mean they don't make it anymore? What?